What time is it right now? You probably glanced at a clock or a phone. Or maybe you just felt you already knew. We all feel that way. Time feels obvious. It feels like the most reliable thing in the universe. Seconds tick. Minutes pass. Days pile up. And here we are. Older than we were a moment ago. But let me slow you down for just a second. When you say right now, what exactly are you pointing to? Is it the number on the screen? Because that number is already old by the time you see it. Is it this moment you're experiencing? Because by the time you notice it, it's already gone. You can't grab the present the way you grab a cup or a pencil. You can only remember it or expect it. Think about waiting in line. 5 minutes can feel like an hour when you're bored, and an hour can vanish when you're absorbed. If time were a simple thing, like a ruler laid across the universe, why would it stretch and shrink inside your head? We grow up trusting time because it seems to move in one direction. We're born, we age, things break, people leave, and they don't come back. A glass falls off a table, shatters, and never politely jumps back together. That feels like time doing something. It feels like time is pushing everything forward, relentlessly. But notice something strange. You've never actually observed time itself. You've only seen clocks move, shadows shift, memories accumulate, and bodies change. We confuse the measuring stick for the thing being measured. When you say time passed, what you really mean is something changed. Your face changed. The sun moved. Your thoughts moved. But did time move? Or did we just invent a word to keep track of change? Imagine you wake up tomorrow and nothing changes. No motion. No decay. No thoughts. No memories forming. Would time still be passing? Or would the idea of time quietly disappear with the changes it was attached to? We are so certain about time because our lives are soaked in it. We schedule our days round it. We fear running out of it. We measure our worth by how efficiently we use it. And yet, when I ask you to point to time itself, not a clock, not an event, not a memory, just time, there's nothing there to grab. There's another uncomfortable thing we rarely admit. Everyone thinks they share the same now. You assume that while you're watching this, there's a universal present moment sweeping across the cosmos, and you're sitting neatly inside it. But you've never checked. You've never compared your now with someone on the other side of the planet, let alone someone moving fast, or far away, or not even born yet. We feel like time flows because our memories pile up in one direction. Yesterday feels fixed, tomorrow feels open, and now feels like a thin, fragile line we're balancing on. But feelings are not evidence. They're adaptations. They evolved to help us survive, not to tell us how the universe truly works. Your brain is a prediction machine, stitching together memories and expectations, and calling that stitched-together experience the present. It works beautifully. It helps you cross streets and avoid danger and tell stories about your life. But usefulness is not the same thing as truth. At one time, the earth felt flat and motionless, and that feeling was extremely convincing. Time might be doing the same thing. It might feel fundamental while quietly being something else entirely. Here's the real crack in the certainty. Modern physics does not need a fling now to describe how the universe works. It doesn't require a cosmic clock ticking away in the background. The equations don't ask what time it is. They ask how things are related. And that should bother you, just a little. Because if time were truly the backbone of reality, it would show up as something undeniable, something unavoidable, something you couldn't explain the universe without. Instead, it behaves suspiciously like a concept we lean on because it matches our experience, not because it's written into the fabric of existence. So, when you confidently answer the question, what time is it right now? You're not wrong in a practical sense. Your appointment still matters. Your alarm will still go off. But at a deeper level, the certainty you feel might be a habit, not a fact. And once you notice that, once that small doubt slips in, it becomes very hard to unsee. Because the real question isn't what time it is. The real question is this: what if time is not what you think it is at all? Why are we so obsessed with time? Not casually interested, not mildly curious, but deeply, emotionally obsessed. We count it, save it, waste it, borrow it, kill it, and panic when we think we're running out of it. That alone should tell you something. We don't talk about air this way, even though we need it to survive. Time occupies a special place in the human mind because it sits right on top of our biggest fear, the fear that everything ends. Death is not experienced as an event in the future. It's imagined as the moment when time stops for you. That's why time feels personal. It doesn't just measure change in the world. It measures the distance between you and your disappearance. Every birthday is quietly counted not as time lived, but as time used up. That framing seeps into everything. Regret lives in the past. Anxiety lives in the future. And the present becomes a narrow escape route between the two. From an evolutionary point of view, this obsession makes perfect sense. A brain that remembers what happened and predicts what might happen is a brain that survives. If you touch fire and feel pain, remembering that event protects you later. If you notice patterns in seasons, predators, or weather, anticipating the future keeps you alive. So the brain builds a timeline. It tags experiences as before and after, strings them together, and treats that string as reality itself. But notice the subtle trick. The brain doesn't actually perceive time. It perceives change and order. It notices that one event followed another, that certain outcomes reliably come after certain actions. From that pattern recognition, the idea of time quietly emerges. Time becomes the story the brain tells to organize events, not something it directly senses. This is why emotional states distort time so dramatically. Fear stretches moments. Boredom makes minutes crawl. Joy compresses hours into what feels like seconds. If time were an external substance flowing at a fixed rate, your emotion shouldn't be able to bend it so easily. But they do, because what you're really feeling is not time itself, but the brain's internal bookkeeping system reacting to significance. High-stakes moments demand more attention, more memory encoding, and when you look back, they feel longer. Low-stakes moments slip by with little trace, and retrospectively they vanish. Memory, not time, is doing the heavy lifting. And memory is deeply tied to identity. You think of yourself as the same person over time because you remember being that person. Without memory, the idea of a personal past collapses. Patients with severe amnesia don't experience a rich timeline stretching behind them. They experience a perpetual, disorienting present. That alone should hint that time, as you live it, is inseparable from how the brain stores information. There's also control. Time gives us the illusion that life is manageable. If we can schedule, plan, optimize, and measure, then maybe we can outrun uncertainty. Calendars and deadlines make the future feel domesticated. But underneath that structure is a quieter truth. The universe does not care about your schedule. Events happen when conditions allow them to happen, not because a clock says it's time. The clock is for us, not for reality. Cultures reveal this clearly. Some societies treat time as a straight line, sliced into units that must not be wasted. Others treat it as a loose rhythm, guided by events rather than hours. If time were a single, objective thing pressing equally on all humans, these differences wouldn't be so dramatic. What's consistent across cultures is not how time is measured, but why it matters. It matters because it helps us coordinate, remember, and anticipate. It helps groups survive. It helps stories exist. And stories are how humans make sense of chaos. A life without a past and a future is not just impractical. It's psychologically unbearable. We need beginnings, middles, and ends. We need to feel that things are going somewhere, even if we're not sure where. So we project that narrative structure onto the universe itself and call it time. The danger comes when we forget that this projection is a tool. We start to treat time as our thing that hunts us, pressures us, judges us. "I'm running out of time" sounds like a physical threat, but it's really a statement about expectations and mortality. You can't lose time the way you lose keys. You can only lose opportunities, and even that depends on what you value. Time becomes a moral scoreboard because it feels impartial, unforgiving, and unstoppable. But that's a psychological rule we've assigned to it, not a property we've measured. Our obsession with time is not evidence that time is fundamental. It's evidence that we are finite, memory-bound creatures trying to navigate a changing world. Time is the mental scaffolding we built to keep ourselves oriented. It works so well that we forget we built it at all. And once you forget that, time stops looking like a tool and starts looking like a law of nature. That's the moment obsession quietly replaces understanding. Now let's talk about what physics actually says about time. Not what it feels like, not what poets say, and not what motivational posters insist on, but what shows up when we try to describe the universe carefully and honestly. For a long time, physics treated time the way everyone intuitively treats it, as something absolute, universal, and independent of everything else. In Newton's picture of the world, time was like a perfectly reliable background clock, ticking away at the same rate everywhere, for everyone, no matter what. Events happened in space, and time simply told you when they happened. You could imagine the entire universe laid out on a giant stage, with a single clock hanging above it, marking a shared now for all things. That picture feels natural because it matches everyday experience. If you and I agree to meet at noon, we assume we're talking about the same moment. Newton's laws work beautifully in this framework, and for centuries, there was no strong reason to doubt it. But physics has a habit of becoming uncomfortable precisely where our intuitions feel safest. When scientists began to understand light more deeply, something strange appeared. Light didn't behave like sound or water waves. No matter how fast you moved, light always appeared to travel at the same speed. That fact alone forced a radical rethinking of time, because if everyone measures the same speed of light, then something else has to give. And what gives is not space alone, but time itself. Einstein's insight was not that time is an illusion, but that time is not separate from space. They are woven together into a single structure we now call spacetime. In this picture, time is not a universal river flowing evenly everywhere. It's a dimension, like space, but one that behaves differently depending on motion and gravity. Two observers moving relative to each other do not agree on how much time passes between the same events. This is not a trick of clocks or a problem with measurement. It's how the universe works. A fast-moving clock genuinely ticks more slowly compared to a stationary one. A clock near a massive object ticks differently than one far away. These effects are small in everyday life, but they're real and measurable. GPS satellites, for example, would fail quickly if engineers did not account for the fact that time passes at different rates for satellites than it does on Earth. What's important here is not the technical detail, but the conceptual shift. Once time depends on motion and gravity, the idea of a single, universal now starts to fall apart. Physics does not provide a master clock for the universe. Instead, each observer carries their own time, shaped by their path through spacetime. Events that you consider simultaneous may not be simultaneous for someone else moving differently. And physics does not privilege either perspective. There is no hidden, correct timeline behind the scenes. This leads to something deeply unsettling for common sense. The equations of physics do not require a flowing present. They describe relationships between events, not a movie playing frame by frame with a glowing now sweeping across it. In fact, many of the fundamental equations work just as well if you reverse time. They don't care which direction is forward. They don't encode a built-in arrow pointing from past to future. That arrow, which feels so obvious in daily life, has to come from somewhere else. When physicists talk about spacetime, they often describe the universe as a four-dimensional structure where events simply are, not happening, not waiting to happen, just existing as part of the structure. This doesn't mean the future is predetermined in some mystical sense, or that choice is meaningless. It means that physics, at its most basic descriptive level, does not need the concept of time flowing. It needs a way to say how events are related, how one state connects to another. The feeling of passage, of time moving, is not written into those equations. And that absence should make you pause, because if time were as fundamental as we feel it is, it would be unavoidable in the mathematics. Instead, it behaves more like a coordinate system, a useful way to label change. Even more striking, when physicists try to combine general relativity with quantum mechanics, time becomes even stranger. In some approaches to quantum gravity, time disappears entirely from the fundamental description. The equations don't ask what happens next. They describe correlations between possible states. Time seems to reappear only when you zoom out, when you look at large-scale behavior and coarse-grained systems like people, planets, and thermodynamic processes. That suggests something provocative but careful. Time may not be fundamental in the way space, fields, or interactions are fundamental. It may be emergent, like temperature. Temperature feels real. It matters, it drives behavior, but it's not a property of individual atoms. It's a collective description that becomes meaningful only when you stop tracking every microscopic detail. Physics, taken seriously, does not say time is fake. That would be sloppy and misleading. What it says is more subtle and more interesting. Time is not the universal backdrop we once thought it was. It does not flow independently of the universe. It does not provide a single shared present. It is tangled up with motion, gravity, and how we describe change. And crucially, the universe does not seem to need a preferred now to function perfectly well. That gap between what physics requires and what we feel is where the real mystery lives. Not in denying time, but in understanding why something that may not be fundamental feels so unavoidable, so emotionally charged, and so central to how we experience reality at all. We talk about now as if it's a solid thing, as if the entire universe shares a single present moment and we're all sitting inside it together. It feels so obvious that questioning it sounds almost silly. Of course there's a now. You're experiencing it. I'm talking in it. Everything seems to be happening right now. But the moment you try to make that idea precise, it slips through your fingers. What exactly is this now made of? And how far does it extend? Does it include the person sitting next to you? Probably. Does it include someone on the other side of the planet? Maybe you think so. Does it include someone in a fast-moving spaceship? Physics says no, not in any objective sense. The problem isn't technological. It's not that we lack good clocks or fast enough signals. The problem is that the universe does not provide a universal definition of simultaneity. To see why, imagine a simple thought experiment. You're standing on a platform, and a train rushes past you at high speed. Two lightning bolts strike the front and the back of the train at the same time, at least according to you. You see the flashes reach you simultaneously, and you conclude they happened at the same moment. Now, consider someone sitting in the middle of the train. That person is moving toward the flash from the front and away from the flash from the back. Light from the front reaches them before light from the back. For them, the strikes did not happen at the same time. One happened earlier. This is not a mistake or an illusion. It's not about delayed signals or human reaction time. Even after correcting for the travel time of light, the disagreement remains. Physics insists that both descriptions are equally valid. There is no deeper fact of the matter about which events truly happened now that should unsettle you, because it means that the present moment is not a universal slice of reality. It's a personal construct tied to your state of motion. If you move differently, you're now tilts. Events you consider simultaneous fall into someone else's past or future. And this isn't a fringe idea. It's built directly into how space-time works. Once you accept that, the idea of a cosmic now dissolves. There is no glowing line sweeping across the universe, lighting up events as present and then dimming them into the past. That image is something our brains desperately want, but physics refuses to provide it. Instead, what exists is a web of events, each with its own relationships to others, ordered differently depending on how you move through space-time. Your now is simply the set of events your brain groups together as present because of how information reaches you and how your nervous system processes it. That grouping is incredibly useful. It lets you act, decide, and respond in real time. But usefulness is not the same as universality. Think about how long now lasts. Is it an instant? Neuroscience suggests that your brain integrates information over a short window, stitching together sensations into what feels like a continuous moment. That window might be a fraction of a second, but it's not zero. Your experience of now already has thickness. It's already a construction, and it's built from slightly out-of-sync signals. Light from your surroundings takes time to reach your eyes. Nerve signals take time to reach your brain. By the time you feel now, you're already looking at the past, just a very recent past. Yet your brain smooths all of this out and presents it as a single moment. It has two, or you couldn't function. The illusion of now is not a flaw. It's a feature. It's what allows a slow, biological system to interact with a fast, physical world. The danger comes when we mistake this biological solution for a statement about reality itself. We assume that because now feels crisp and undeniable, it must exist as a fundamental feature of the universe. But physics quietly tells us otherwise. It says that simultaneity is relative, that different observers carve up space-time in different ways, and that none of those carvings is privileged. There is no master perspective standing outside the universe, declaring what is truly happening at this very moment. That role exists only in our minds. Once you see that, the present moment starts to look less like a universal fact and more like a local agreement. A shared illusion maintained by beings who move slowly, think locally, and rely on similar sensory delays. Your now works beautifully for living a human life. It just doesn't scale to the cosmos. And that gap between what feels absolutely real and what physics actually supports is where the illusion lies. If time is not fundamental in the deepest description of the universe, then why does it feel so solid, so unavoidable, so real in everyday life? The short answer is that reality at the human scale is built out of patterns, not fundamentals. And time is one of the most powerful patterns we know how to recognize. The key idea here is entropy, which sounds technical but really isn't. Entropy is just a way of talking about how many different microscopic arrangements correspond to the same large-scale situation. A neat stack of papers can be arranged in only a few ways. A messy pile can be arranged in countless ways. If you disturb the system, it's overwhelmingly likely to move toward the messier configuration, simply because there are more ways to be messy than neat. That statistical tendency creates a direction. We call that direction the arrow of time. This is why glasses shatter but don't reassemble. why smoke spreads but doesn't unspread, why you remember the past but not the future. Memory itself is an entropy-increasing process. To store information, your brain must change physical states, burn energy, and leave traces. Those traces point in one direction only. So time feels real because the processes that define your life are all aligned along the same statistical slope. Cause comes before effect, not because the universe enforces a rule, but because effects usually involve more disorder than causes. That alignment gives rise to the strong intuition of flow. Add to that the way the brain constructs experience. Your nervous system is constantly updating a model of the world, using past information to predict what will happen next. It cannot run in reverse. It cannot base decisions on information that hasn't been recorded yet. So your conscious experience is inevitably ordered. You feel yourself moving from past to future because that is how information processing works in physical systems like brains. There's no extra substance called time pushing you along. There's just change, memory, and prediction, all pointing the same way. And because this structure is so stable, so consistent, and so useful, it takes on the weight of reality. Temperature feels real too, even though it's not a property of individual atoms. Money feels real, even though it's a social agreement. Time feels real because it reliably organizes experience and behavior at the scale we live in. The mistake is not feeling time. The mistake is assuming that because it feels fundamental, it must be fundamental. What physics suggests is that time is more like a direction that emerges from the way complex systems behave, not a thing that exists on its own. It's real in the way waves are real in the ocean, not separate from the water, but impossible to ignore once they appear. When people hear physicists or philosophers say time is not real, they often take it to mean something far stronger and far stranger than what is actually intended. They imagine that time is some kind of illusion you can simply think your way out of, that the past and future don't exist at all, or that everything is happening simultaneously in some mystical blur. That interpretation is seductive, especially online, because it sounds rebellious and profound. But it's also sloppy. Physics does not say that time is fake, meaningless, or optional. What it says is that time may not be fundamental in the way we once assumed. That distinction matters. If you miss it, you end up with claims that sound deep, but explain nothing. One common mistake is treating not fundamental as doesn't exist. Temperature is not fundamental either, but it's very real. You can't ignore it in a heat wave. It affects behavior, causes damage, and shapes outcomes. Time works the same way. Even if it emerges from deeper physical processes, it still governs how systems behave at our scale. Another mistake is confusing human experience with cosmic description. People say, "I feel time passing, therefore time is flowing." But feeling is not measurement. You also feel the Earth is stationary, yet it's spinning and orbiting at enormous speed. Experience is a guide to survival, not a guarantee of truth. Physics is careful precisely because it does not privilege how things feel. There's also a tendency to turn careful scientific statements into absolute metaphysical claims. When physicists say that fundamental equations don't include a preferred now, that doesn't mean that the present moment is meaningless in your life. It means that the universe does not come with a built-in label saying this is the present for everyone. Your experience of now still matters. It still structures decisions, emotions, and relationships. Denying that would be absurd. Another misunderstanding comes from mixing different ideas together without noticing. Relativity, entropy, quantum mechanics, and consciousness all touch time in different ways, and they do not all say the same thing. Lumping them together into a single slogan like time isn't real, flattens important distinctions. It replaces understanding with vibe. And finally, there's a subtle but dangerous error. Using time is not real as an excuse to dismiss responsibility, causation, or meaning. If nothing is really in the past or future, why care about consequences? But physics never licenses that move. Cause and effect still operate. Actions still lead to outcomes. Entropy still increases. Lives still unfold. The honest position is not that time vanishes under scrutiny, but that our everyday picture of it is incomplete. Physics challenges us to refine our concepts, not abandon them. Saying time is not real without explanation doesn't make you insightful. Understanding what time does, where it comes from, and where it stops being useful does. Let me suggest a different way to think about time, one that avoids worshipping it and avoids dismissing it. Instead of asking whether time is real, ask what job the idea of time is doing. Physics is full of concepts that are not pieces of the universe but tools we use to organize our understanding of it. Think about a map. A map is not the territory. No one confuses the paper with the mountain. But a good map can still be astonishingly accurate and unbelievably useful. Time is like that. It is a coordinate system we invented to keep track of change, causation, and memory. The mistake is forgetting that it's a map and starting to treat it like the ground beneath our feet. When you look at a map, you don't ask where the red "you are here" dot is in the real world. The dot exists only on the map. The same may be true of the present moment. Now could be a marker we place on our internal model of reality to help us navigate, not a glowing feature of the universe itself. Physics encourages this humility. It repeatedly shows us that useful concepts do not have to be fundamental. Electric fields, pressure, temperature, even particles themselves can be ways of summarizing deeper behavior. We keep them not because they're ultimate, but because they work. Time earns its place the same way. It organizes sequences, stabilizes expectations, and allows prediction. That's its job. Trouble begins when we ask time to do more than that, when we expect it to explain existence, meaning, or fate. It was never built for that. From this perspective, the flow of time is not something happening to the universe. It's something happening in our description of the universe. As systems interact, leave records, and increase entropy, our best summaries line up along a direction. We draw an arrow through our models and call it time. That arrow is not an illusion in the sense of being wrong. It's an abstraction, like a center of mass. The center of mass of an object is not a physical point you can touch, but it's indispensable if you want to predict motion. No physicist argues about whether the center of mass is real in some metaphysical sense. They ask whether it's useful. Time deserves the same treatment. This way of thinking also explains why physics can function without a universal now. If time is a coordinate, not a substance, then different observers are free to choose different coordinates. No single choice is privileged. Each one is adapted to a particular way of moving through the world. That's not a bug. It's a feature of a flexible, powerful description. And it should be oddly comforting. It means the universe is not rushing you along on some cosmic conveyor belt. There is no external clock judging whether you're ahead or behind. There are only processes unfolding according to their own conditions. You enter the picture not as a victim of time, but as a participant in change. Feynman liked to say that the test of understanding is whether you can see things from more than one angle at once. Time invites that kind of thinking. You can use it, respect it, and rely on it, while also remembering that it is not the final word on reality. You can plan your day without believing the universe is built out of minutes. You can feel the urgency of a moment without assuming that urgency is written into spacetime itself. This shift doesn't make life colder or emptier. If anything, it does the opposite. When you stop treating time as a tyrant and start treating it as a tool, You regain a sense of proportion. Time stops being something that happens to you and starts being something you work with. And that is a much more honest and much more human way to think about it. So why does any of this matter to your life? Beyond being an interesting idea about the universe. Because the way you think about time quietly shapes how you treat yourself and others. If time is a force that is always pushing you forward, always running out, then life feels like a race you're constantly losing. Aging becomes a threat. Regret hardens into identity. The past feels like a weight, the future like a countdown. But if time is not a thing chasing you, if it's a way we organize change rather than a substance draining away, something softens. You still age, things still end, loss still hurts. Physics does not remove those facts. What it can remove is the extra layer of cruelty we add by imagining an invisible clock judging every moment. Regret, for example, depends on the idea that the past is a place you should still be able to visit and fix. But the past is not a location. It's a record. It exists as traces in memory, documents, and consequences, not as a room you failed to return to on time. Understanding this doesn't erase mistakes, but it can loosen their grip. Forgiveness, both of yourself and of others, becomes easier when you see that no one is being dragged along a timeline they can control. The same goes for fear of aging. We often think of getting older as time taking something away from us. But what's really happening is change accumulating. Experience is being added, not subtracted. The sadness comes from comparing different stages as if they were competing for the same slot on a timeline. They're not. They're different configurations of the same life. When you stop imagining time as a thief, you can appreciate those configurations without turning them into a lost calculation. Even the idea of living in the present takes on a gentler meaning. It doesn't become a command to trap yourself in a razor-thin instant. It becomes an invitation to notice what information is actually available to you right now, and what isn't. Worrying about the future often feels like foresight. But it's mostly imagination running ahead of evidence. Rumination about the past feels like responsibility, but it's often memory looping without new input. Seeing time as a tool reminds you where your leverage actually is in the choices you make with the information you have. This perspective doesn't promise peace or happiness. It promises honesty. Life still unfolds. You still make plans, miss chances, and feel moments slipping by. But beneath all that motion, there's less pressure to keep up with an imaginary flow. You're not late to your own life. You are not behind the universe. You are simply participating in change, one moment at a time. Whether or not that moment has a name, let me leave you with one last thought, and I don't want you to answer it quickly. In fact, if you can answer it at all, you've probably missed the point. Imagine the universe without any labels. No clocks, no calendars, no past or future written in words. Just events related to other events, changes connected to changes. In that universe, where exactly would you point and say, "That is now"? Not when would you say it. Where would you put it? Because the moment you try, you're forced to admit that now is not something you find in the world, but something you bring to it. That doesn't make it worthless. It makes it revealing. We like to think that time is what carries us along, that it's the reason things begin and end, that it explains why our lives feel fragile. But maybe it's the other way round. Maybe our lives feel fragile because they're made of change, and time is the name we give to that fact so we can live with it. Physics doesn't take time away from you. It takes away the comforting fiction that there is a master schedule somewhere, keeping track of what matters and when. There isn't. Meaning doesn't arrive on time. It doesn't wait for the right moment. It's not delivered by the future or stored in the past. It appears wherever attention, memory, and action line up. That alignment is something you participate in, not something you measure. So the next time you catch yourself saying, "I don't have enough time," pause and ask what you really mean. Are you missing minutes, or are you missing clarity? Are you being chased by a clock, or are you facing a choice you don't want to make yet? Those are very different problems, and only one of them belongs to physics. If there is a scar I hope this leaves, it's this quiet discomfort, the sense that the universe is not organized around your timeline, and yet your life still matters intensely. Not because of where it sits in time, but because of how it connects to everything else. If you feel that and don't rush to smooth it over, if you let it sit with you for a while, then I've done my job. Feynman smiles, shrugs slightly, and stops talking.